Last week we ticked a cross-stitch video off the requests list, and this week we are doing knitting, because that requests backlog will not defeat me. Today I'm going to walk you through how to read knitting patterns and some general tips for making sense of them. We're going to cover both written and charted patterns, as well as things common to both, what a knitting pattern will generally expect you to know going in, and just some general pitfalls that you might come across on your adventures. Then I suppose I'll have to make a crochet version of this video at some point as well. Okay, let's get cracking. For those unaware, there are two main ways to communicate a knitting pattern. One is in written form, where the instructions for each row will be written out in words and make heavy use of abbreviations. And the other is a chart which uses symbols to get that same message across. A lot of knitters have a preference for one over the other, but I think it's very useful to be able to read both, especially since so many patterns use a combination of the two. So by the end of this video, that is exactly what you're going to be able to do. Now, there is a lot of variation in the exact format of both written and charted patterns, but they should always include a standard set of information such as the following. Recommended yarn. This is important because it'll usually tell you not only the weight of the yarn, but also either it'll mention the fibre content or give you a specific brand which you can then look up to find the fibre content. Yarn weight is absolutely crucial because of gauge, which we will get to momentarily, but fibre content is also extremely important to know. You do not need to be using the exact same yarn as recommended, but using a similar fibre content is going to mean that your piece ends up with similar properties. For example, if you are knitting socks, the recommended pattern yarn probably includes nylon, because nylon in yarn helps to reinforce and reduce wear-related damage, which is super important on something that is going to be shoved into shoes and walked around on. Obviously, this is a gateway to a much bigger topic that is not necessarily super related to reading knitting patterns, but if you are new, just use the recommended fibre content as a guide and you shouldn't go far wrong. Recommended needle size. Combined with the specific weight of your yarn, the needle size is going to control what sort of fabric you end up with. Perhaps the pattern calls for a quite dense, stiff fabric, in which case you might be using a needle that's quite small for the size of the yarn. Or maybe it's going to be the exact opposite. The needle size is only ever a rough guideline, however, because what you are really interested in here is the gauge. Gauge tells you how many stitches and rows should measure what if you use the recommended yarn and needle size. For example, this pattern expects you to achieve 28 stitches and 22 rows in a 4-inch square of stockinette. Other patterns will ask you to swatch a particular stitch pattern, or maybe even more than one. But because we all knit at a different tension, your mileage with the recommended needle size may vary. Personally, I'm quite a loose knitter, so I always know that I need to start at least 0.5 millimeter down from the recommended needle size in order to achieve gauge. This is really important to get right, especially in a project like a garment that needs to end up a specific size. Being a stitch or two out on your gauge swatch might not seem like the end of the world, but before you know it, it's multiplied across your project, and now your huge cozy cardigan is fit only for a child. Or your hat project can now fit 3 heads in it. Again, getting gauge is a bigger topic, so if anyone out there wants a more detailed video on this, I can certainly oblige. But I expect you can find lots of existing info out there already. Now, sizing. This might not apply at all to your pattern, but for something like a garment, it's usually going to come in multiple sizes, and these are often represented in the pattern through brackets. For example, this pattern comes in 9 sizes. So in the instructions, you'll see the correct number of stitches is given for the smallest size, and then the others are all in brackets. This can be kind of confusing as it adds a lot of visual noise with all of these numbers everywhere. I needed to knit the large size here, which is the 4th size along, therefore it's the 3rd number in the brackets. And remembering that and picking it out every single time can be a bit annoying. Couple of ways to handle this. You could print out the pattern and highlight just the number you need in every bracket, so when you actually come to knit from it, you can see at a glance. Similarly, if you're sticking to digital format, you could use a PDF highlighter app to do the exact same thing. A more dramatic solution I've seen is that some people will actually rewrite the entire knitting pattern in a format that makes more sense to them, including just the numbers they need for their particular size. It's really not too bad once you get used to it, but I admit the sheer wall of numbers can sometimes be a bit intimidating. What I would say there is remember you're only knitting one size at a time, so you only need to actually pay attention to one of those numbers. It's definitely not as bad as it looks. thanks. So in terms of written patterns then, the main thing to note is that they can get quite wordy and it can look pretty confusing. But similarly to what we just said about sizing, you're always going to be focused on just one line or maybe one section at a time. To save space, patterns rely on abbreviations for common terms, and every pattern will be in a slightly different format, so one thing you want to do is make sure you know where to find those abbreviations, as chances are you will be referring to them quite a lot. Usually they'll be near the beginning of the pattern, but sometimes you will find them at the end instead. Most common stitches have standard abbreviations that you'll see all the time. K is going to be knit stitch, P is going to be purl, a yarn over is usually YO, and often patterns will abbreviate the word stitch as well. If I see K2 tog, I know without having to look any deeper that that's a simple knit two together decrease. Sometimes your pattern will have a custom abbreviation for a more complex series of stitches, and usually they will explain that in this abbreviation section. You might also find that there's an abbreviation for a less common stitch that you don't already know. Maybe you've never done cables before, but all the abbreviation section is telling you is that C2B means cable 2 back. How do you do a cable 2 back? Well, I'm afraid you're gonna have to look it up. The pattern isn't trying to actually teach you to knit, and it will assume that you either come into it with the knowledge you need or you're able to find it. Which you totally can. We live on the internet now. It's really fine. Okay, so once you're familiar with the abbreviations and you've maybe found a tutorial for any you don't know how to do, it's time to move on to actually following the pattern. And honestly, it's pretty straightforward. The instructions will be written in a fairly linear style, row by row. Or if you're knitting in the round, it may say round X instead of row X. But the principle is the same. Start at the beginning of the line and just follow it across. This example is from the toe section of a sock pattern, so by the time you get to this point you've already knit most of your sock and you even have some stitch markers in there. Let's see how that looks. Round 1. K, which we know means knit, to 3 stitches before the marker. A comma just basically means then, so knit to 3 stitches before the marker, then do a knit 2 together decrease, then knit 1. Then slip your marker from one needle to the other. Then knit 1 again. Then slip, slip, knit, decrease. Then knit until there are 3 stitches left before the next marker. Then knit together. Then knit 1. Then slip marker. Then knit 1. Then slip, slip, knit. Then knit all the way to the end of the round. Clearly, that is a lot of info in one line of text. But you're always just doing one thing at a time. You're knitting 1 stitch, then you're knitting 2 together, then you're doing the next thing. Knitting patterns are so wordy because they need to be very precise in their instruction. But when you're actually following them, it probably takes less time to knit that line than it did for me to read it out, you know? So let's see what comes next. Round 2, knit. Now that is more like it. On this round you would just literally knit all of the stitches until you're back where you started. It could also be written as knit all or knit across, but the gist is going to be the same. So let's talk about repeats, because you're going to see those a lot. It's exactly what it sounds like, just a chunk of instruction that you are going to be asked to repeat over and over again. They can come in a few different forms though, so let's just take a look at a few examples. The next instruction after our rounds 1 and 2 previously is to repeat the last 2 rows 6 times to 36 stitches. So we've done rounds 1 and 2. We're going to do rounds 1 and 2 6 more times, and in this example, at the end of all that, we should end up with 36 stitches. Round 1 included doing 4 decreases, so if we end up with 40 stitches, we know we still have 1 repeat to go, and if we end up with 32 stitches, oops, we did one too many. Stitch counts are really useful to have in situations like this because, admittedly, it is pretty easy to lose track sometimes. Another type of repeat you might see is one within the row itself, and these are usually marked either with an asterisk or brackets. This line is from elsewhere in the same pattern. The basic instructions are simple: knit 2 stitches, then purl 2 stitches, and then it says something about a repeat. So, you look back at where that asterisk appeared. In this case, it's right at the beginning of the row in front of the K2. Find the last thing that happens before it says repeat. That's the P2. So you repeat everything from K2 to P2, and in this case there's nothing in between those 2 things, but if there was, you would repeat it all right up until that P2. How many times do you repeat? Well, in this particular example it says to end, which is pretty self-explanatory, but it could also give you a specific number of times. You might sometimes see it formatted more like this with brackets, which I personally find looks a bit cleaner, but if a pattern is using brackets for its sizing, then obviously they can't also be used for repeats, so it just depends on the particular pattern you're using. Usually the repeated part won't be the only instruction, so you could see something more like this. So knit 1 stitch, then do our bit in the brackets twice, then knit another stitch. One last type of repeat is what's generally known as a pattern repeat, which is a set of instructions that you're going to be given once and asked to use multiple times through the pattern. So, for example, on these socks that I've just finished knitting, the pattern gives written instructions for constructing the sock and just tells me to continue eyelet rib pattern at the same time. The eyelet rib pattern is given just once at the start of the pattern. Because this is a 4-row repeat, writing it out explicitly 100 times would really increase the length of the pattern PDF and would make it way less clear to read. This is an example of what I said earlier, where an otherwise written pattern will also include a chart, so it is really useful to be able to interpret both. One last thing I would say on written patterns is that they've changed quite a bit over the years, so exactly what you get might depend on the age of the pattern you're using. Older patterns did tend to be a lot less hand-holdy and would assume certain knowledge, or that you were able to fill in the gaps between instructions, which again is fine because we live on the internet now. Newer patterns are much more likely to give you explicit instructions on anything that goes in anywhere outside the norm, so if you are quite new, that's just something to bear in mind. Okay, feels like I have been talking forever already, but we still haven't even looked at charts. You got a sneak peek of what a simple chart might look like a minute ago, and really the principle here is the same as with written patterns. You go row by row or round by round, and you just follow each instruction in order. There are two very big differences though. First one is obvious, charts rely on symbols rather than written abbreviations. But also, charts are maybe not read in the direction that you might expect. So, okay, if we already have written patterns and they work fine, what is the point in charts? First of all, they are so much more space efficient. The pattern that this chart came from used about 1.75 pages to cover all of the written instructions and abbreviations, etc., whereas it took less than 1 page to put all of that in charted form. Knitting patterns are often published in magazines or books where there's only limited space, so being able to save so much is a big deal. Not to mention, of course, it's less pages to print out if that is something you like to do. A good chart also gives you a visual representation of what it is you're going to be knitting. For example, you'd be hard pressed to find a chart where the symbol for a yarn over is not a circle like this, because of course a yarn over makes a little eyelet hole in the fabric, so this makes sense as a visual. Decreases lean in one direction or the other, so their symbols do too. And a complex cabling chart is a thing of easily grasped beauty. Also, I can't believe I forgot to mention this, but if you can read charts, you can often interpret patterns that aren't written in your native language, which is pretty handy. Basically, my hot take is that charts are just plain better. Anyway, about that direction thing. Let's look again at the pattern repeat chart from my socks. The numbers over on the right here are the round numbers, and since the numbers are on the right, this tells me that my chart should be read from right to left. More about that in a second. Each square on the chart represents a stitch, so this would be our first stitch and this would be our last. This seems odd at first for people who are used to reading left to right, but in terms of knitting, you do actually complete stitches from right to left and bottom to top, so it makes perfect sense if you think about it. Because this chart is from a sock pattern, it's to be knitted in the round, which is why each round number is on the same side here. I knit from right to left, all the way around the sock until I'm back where I started and ready to knit the next round in the same way. If you're working on a flat piece though, your chart might look more like this. As you can see, it still has row numbers marked at the side and will still be starting in the bottom right. But the row numbers alternate between right and left. Now, you always start at the end where the row number is. So we'll be knitting row 1 right to left, then row 2 left to right, row 3 right to left, and so on and so forth. This might seem a bit confusing at first, but really it just represents the back and forth nature of knitting flat rather than knitting in the round. Essentially, always just start at the side where the row numbers are and you will be absolutely fine. So how do you actually read these? It's a bit like what we talked about with abbreviations earlier, where there do tend to be standard symbols that are used over and over again in most patterns. So an empty square in the chart is usually going to mean a knit stitch, and a dot like this is usually going to mean purl. Always worth checking the chart key, of course, because some patterns will use a completely different system, but generally you do get used to the conventions pretty quick. On row 1 then, we do 2 knit stitches, 1 purl, 2 knit, 1 purl, 2 knit, and you guessed it, 1 purl, and then 1 last knit to finish the row. One thing that does tend to throw people in flat charts though is what I will call the reversibility of some symbols. Let's take a step back for a second. You are knitting a flat piece. You're on the right side of your work and you do a knit stitch. Now if you flip that piece over and you look at the knit stitch you just made, from the wrong side it will look like a purl stitch. If you make a purl stitch on the right side of your work and flip it over, it will look like a knit stitch. So because those stitches are reversible depending which side you're on, the symbols are as well. Generally, a chart will specify that it starts on the right side. So row 1 you would read as we just did, knits and purls. But on row 2 we would be working back across on the wrong side. So that empty square now represents a purl stitch and the dot represents a knit. One way to understand this is to think of the chart as representing what the knitted piece will look like from the right side specifically. So working purls on row 2 is going to give us those intended knit stitches from the right side. I hope that made sense. I feel like maybe I just overcomplicated things, but if I did, feel free to ask clarifying questions down in the comments. I will do my best. Anyway, we've covered most of what does seem to confuse people their first time looking at a chart, but there is one more thing I want to mention because I've seen it cause so much trouble and it really blows people's minds. That is the concept of no stitch. You'll see this pretty frequently in lace knitting especially. It tends to be a greyed out square in the chart, although again, refer to your chart key, and it basically just means completely ignore this stitch, do nothing. But it turns out a lot of people can't quite get their heads around that at first, so allow me to at least try and explain. In the example, this symbol here is a decrease that turns 3 stitches into just 1, and this symbol is an increase that turns 1 stitch into 3. So on row 2 you can see there are 3 knit stitches in between our purl columns there. On row 3, those 3 knit stitches get decreased into just 1, so there's nothing else that needs to be represented in between those purl columns. In row 4 they're increased back to our usual stitch count. The no stitch symbol here really just helps the chart stay at the same number of squares, even though the number of stitches on your needle is changing between those rows. Literally, if you come across this in a chart, just completely ignore that stitch. It does not exist. Just go straight from whatever you were doing before it to whatever it tells you to do after it. That's it. Finally then, just a quick note on repeats in a chart. Charts will often be repeatable horizontally, so your pattern might tell you to repeat it to the end of the row or a specific number of times. That is a simple type of repeat. It might also repeat vertically, so your instructions might tell you to knit chart A 3 times and then chart B twice. But there's also the potential for a repeat to be marked in the chart itself, which is pretty common, but especially in shawls. For example, I'm going to blur most of this out because it is someone else's pattern, but the shaded section in the middle is the repeat. So you'll knit the first white section, then repeat the shaded section however many times the accompanying instructions tell you to, and then you'll knit the final white section which takes you to the end of the row. As I'm sure you've figured out by now, the general concepts are the same whether a pattern is written or charted. It's really just a matter of presentation. My goal with this video was to help you understand both formats, but I absolutely do not expect you to love them both equally. We all have different ways of visualizing, different ways of learning, and we just grok things differently. So if you saw those charts and you had a eureka moment, then brilliant. But if you sort of understand charts now but you think you'd just rather stick to the written version, that's totally fine as well. You do you. The only thing you need to remember is to check what format a pattern is in before buying it. The last thing you want is to get stuck knitting something from a format that you utterly despise. Okay, this did end up being a little bit of a deep dive, but I do hope it helped somebody out there. If you've stuck with me right until the end, thank you very much, I appreciate it a lot. As always, of course, thank you very much to my enablers over on Ko-fi, and especially to the Stitch Squad, who this week are Stitching Liz, Mary Ann Johnson, Sunny, Candy Riley Pettinger, Laura Salads, Rosalie, and our newest member, Enlightened Flamingo. You helped me afford some better video storage this month, so seriously, it makes a difference. Okay, I'll be back soon with some more crafty nonsense, so in the meantime, have a brilliant rest of your day and keep making cool stuff. Bye!